Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Jeremy Solhild and we're joined both by a co-host for once, Chris, but more importantly our guest today is Drachinifel, whom you will know from Drachinifel, the Naval History YouTube channel. Welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And our main topic today is mostly going to focus around doing public history online. There will probably be some questions about naval history that come up in the course of that. But we thought it would be good to reach out to people who work in other areas of online public history, and YouTube is probably the most obvious one where you will hear people's voices as well and thus recognize the person behind the proverbial microphone. To start us off, I think one thing that strikes me as very similar in terms of what we do both on Ask Historians and on your channel is there's a lot of question and answer as well as opportunities to just go off in your own direction. And I know that you do a bit more of the latter, but also dry dock.
Yeah.
And so in that kind of realm, what I was interested in is what does your research process look like for each different format? Are you kind of going about things about the same way or...
Yeah, so for all three main video formats, so 5-minute guides, dry dock, and the Wednesday videos, I tend to follow what I call the rule of threes in terms of sourcing, but how extensive that sourcing is will depend on the video. So for something like a 5-minute guide, I mean, it's a fairly basic rundown, when and where the ship was built, when it was launched, speed, protection, firepower, that sort of stuff, brief potted history. It's not going to go in particularly in depth because of the time restriction on that format. So for that kind of thing, I will generally go, as I said, excuse me, with the rule of threes, I'll generally go with 3 books by reputed authors. So in the naval, that be people like Doolin and Garsky, Raven and Roberts, Norman Friedman, D.K. Brown, that kind of thing. And it's a case of refer to at least 3 books by good authors who have covered those ships, and then go, okay, well, hopefully they'll all agree, in which case, fantastic. There's very little chance of them all being wrong. And in the case of there being a disagreement, this is why you go with a minimum of 3, because then, if 2 people say one thing, one person says the other, you can usually make an educated guess as to whether or not, is that one just got something slightly wrong, or if all 3 disagree, then you have to do further digging. For the dry dock, it depends very much on the question. So some questions are pretty much the same process. Other questions are more opinion based. So, I'll just give my opinion there. And some questions are really interesting because they're fairly short, but then I think about them and I go, oh, hang on a minute. I don't think anyone's actually covered that in any particular detail, at which point it's off down a rabbit hole chasing down, weird and wonderful bits of history, which can get quite interesting because it means for a typical dry dock, sometimes it can take 5 to 10 minutes to record a 5 to 10 minute answer. But the next question, that whole video might be on hold for a week while I pop down to the Q archives to look up primary sources. And then when you get to the Wednesday videos, the long format ones, that's when sourcing really gets involved, because whilst for the more general details, I'll still stick with, at least 3, usually 3 to 5 books by well-reputed authors. A lot of the details in the Wednesday videos will also be sourced from primary documents. Fortunately, especially the National Archives of the US, NARA, they've got a lot of stuff that's available online, which is useful for someone like me in the UK. I also have a few friends who actually live in and around DC who are able to, if I need a specific document, they're able to go and get it for me. I live within half an hour of Kew, the UK National Archives, and about an hour of Portsmouth, so I can also hunt down archival documents myself. And sometimes that's just necessary for filling in things. So, there might be a fairly good narrative history of what's going on, but then for a specific battle or a specific incident in the ship's career, or an admiral's career or whatever, then you suddenly go, well, it just covers that in 2 sentences, but this is actually a really important part of the ship's career. So that's, you have to go and find out those details. And it varies depending on the video. So, for example, recently I did a video on British naval exercises in the interwar period. The fact is, no one has written about them. They're mentioned. So, for example, there's a recent really good book called Fighting in the Dark that Vince O'Hara and Trent Hone and a whole bunch of other historians collaborated on. And they mention one particularly famous, it wasn't even a particularly famous exercise, it was a particularly famous incident within one exercise. So that's a relatively well-known piece. But how the rest of that exercise went over the sort of several weeks and how the other exercises that year went, etc., no one's written a book about that. So I had to go down to Q and just say, right, give me a dozen documents, which are the fleet exercise reports that, a lot of them were classified up till the 70s for some bizarre reason, just in case the Soviets in the early 70s wanted to know exactly what HMS Argus was doing in 1923. And that video is basically in pretty much entirely based out of me reading those primary documents and then collating them in a method that's a bit more understandable than 16 different viewpoints from 16 different ship captains. Everything all across. As I say, I'm quite fortunate that I've got quite a few friends nowadays in different places who can look up various documents for me if I'm not physically in that country. And very occasionally also there's sometimes call for me to do direct translation work. So again, relatively recently, in the last couple of months, I did a video on the voyage of the Glorioso, Spanish treasure ship in the Age of Sail. Now, there is some work in the public sphere about that in English, but it's mostly web articles, which are unsourced, which, with the best will in the world, if you're trying to represent yourself as a serious historian, you can't go, well, I read this somewhere on the internet. So I looked for an English language source on the Voyage of Gloriosa, couldn't find any. There were a few scattered references to specific encounters where it fought British ships, but that's obviously just purely from the British side. It doesn't tell you why it was going anywhere and what it was doing in the bits when it wasn't fighting Royal Navy warships. So in the end, I actually had to track down a couple of books in Spanish, because obviously they have a bit more interest in it, get them from Spain, and then translate them, which was a bit of an exercise in and of itself. But that was the only way to get decent information. And it's the same thing sometimes with some Japanese stuff. Sometimes fortunately, again, someone managed to put me on the tail of a copy of digital copies of Sensei Shoho, which is the Japanese official war history of World War II, the vast majority of which has not been translated into English. But I have some pretty decent translation software and a couple of friends who speak Japanese, so I can go in and do a high-level pass over the titles of different volumes and go, okay, this looks like it's covering the theater in question, then do another high-level pass and go, okay, well, this is roughly what it's all saying, and then I can go, okay, well, these are the segments I actually need to know in detail, and then I can pass them over for translation. So I've got little bits of, I'm probably the only person with little bits of those volumes translated into English. But again, there's a massive sliding scale. It really depends on what you're looking at.
I mean, it sounds like a much more, I suppose, involved process than some people might expect, and especially from in some ways YouTube history, because there's no explicit standard for doing history on YouTube. I mean, there's such a wide variety of things, from one person summarizing a Wikipedia article with some MS Paint illustrations up to full on archival stuff, which I think segues quite nicely into I think, where do you see both yourself in a sort of broader landscape of historical knowledge production, and where I think YouTube can fit as well within kind of a broader perspective?
So I see myself as within the landscape, I guess, of YouTube history and history in general. Obviously, I want to make a living out of it, but I've always tried to hold myself to a standard of, if I say something and someone challenges me on it, I want to either be able to explain to them immediately, well, this is why I said it, or if it's a question about something like what happened as opposed to why, I want to be able to say, well, I said this because I researched it and this person or this document said this. And if I can't defend that, then it shouldn't go in the video. And if there's a conflict where multiple sources all disagree, then I have to qualify and say, well, perhaps this happened, reportedly this happened. But essentially, I want to be able to back up everything I say. And I mean, obviously, there's still going to be disagreements between historians on what did happen. So maybe my source says this, but someone else's source says that. But that's where I see myself is, I would rather spend more time working on a video to make sure it's accurate, even if it's not necessarily going to have and end up with a result that matches what a lot of people think might have happened, than just churn out loads and loads of stuff, which is just either, yes, well, of course, everybody knows this happened, sort of pop history type stuff, or stuff that's just horrifically, blatantly wrong, even if it looks flashy. And I think I'm doing relatively well with that, because I always take the view of getting views is nice, but for me personally, the fact that people who have done something I've discussed and they've done it as a living. So, for example, when I did my video on naval boilers, I got quite a few emails from people who'd worked on the exact systems I was discussing, at least the later ones. And they were saying, look, you got it completely right. This was really good. And so I sit there and I go, well, if someone who worked on a 600 psi pressurized steam boiler in the US Navy says that what I said about that system is correct, I'm going to take that over random account that's more a jumble of letters and numbers on the internet. It's like, well, actually, I think this. And it's like, well, sorry, mate, but you don't know anywhere near as much as a guy whose living and life depended on those things working. And similarly, when it comes to interviewing and chatting with, a lot of the times, the people who wrote a lot of the books that I refer to, if those people who have specialized in specific elements of naval history turn around and say, well, I've watched your videos and I think they're really good. Again, it's like, if people like John Parshall or Trent Hone or Vince O'Hara are happy, or, Professor Andrew Lambert, if they're happy to sit there and go, yeah, I'm going to give you the time of day because I think you're doing a good job, that means a lot more to me than someone on the internet, again, who, the anonymous user who thinks they know everything about everything.
Yeah.
There was a second part to the question as well. Sorry, I think I might have.
Where do you see YouTube fitting into a broader landscape of historical knowledge creation? I mean, in its current state, is it capable of actually being a pretty good platform for that, or is kind of the problem that quality is variable?
I think it could be, and I think elements of it are, but I think you hit the nail on the head, right, which is the fact that quality is incredibly variable. Anyone can upload to YouTube as long as they don't do something massively offensive. And that means you can have people who have the requisite qualifications, who do the research, etc. But you can also have channels that, frankly, don't deserve the title of history-based channels. They're essentially fancy clickbait in boat form. And they can get views because a lot of them, to be honest, are content farms, and they're chucking stuff out there for the sake of just getting the clicks. And unfortunately, it means that if someone does go on YouTube, depending on what format they like listening to and like watching, they can come away very severely misinformed, or they can be very well informed. Like I say, it depends on who they end up listening to. So I think YouTube as a whole, it has a lot of potential because, let's face it, a lot of people watch YouTube. A lot of people, I think, these days prefer, especially amongst the younger generation, they prefer YouTube to TV. And actually, YouTube is a more accessible format because if you want, let's say, to listen to history, if you are watching it on TV, do you want to get a Disney Plus, Apple TV, Netflix, Amazon Primes, etc., and in the UK TV license as well, subscriptions? and try and pick and choose between which programs you're going to watch out of all the other stuff that's there. And you can only watch it on TV or maybe on your mobile, whereas with YouTube, almost anything that's digitally accessible to the internet, you can listen or watch YouTube on. So it's got a lot of portability, it's got a lot of popularity. And the other thing I think is that when it comes to commercial productions, a good chunk of them either will go for the lowest common denominator, or they're beholden to commercial interests in some way, shape, or form. And that means you tend to get, ironically enough, with a lot of, not all, but a lot of TV documentaries nowadays, you can actually get incorrect information. The popular myths that have grown up that just get repeated because a TV producer doesn't know anything about history. He just wants a product out there and it sounds good. And also the format of a lot of TV programs means that actually not a huge amount of information gets imparted in an hour. Because if you think about, not naming any specific TV channel, but if you have an hour history documentary, well, that's actually more of a 40-minute documentary because they've cut it into segments to allow for 20 minutes of ad breaks during the thing. And then they usually spend a couple of minutes after each ad break recapping everything they just said. And at least half of it will be pithy quotation. Now watch this bit of stock footage or this fancy 3D graphic for 30 seconds while we don't say anything. So if you actually take the narrative, regardless of whether it's actually accurate or not, but if you actually take the narrative from what would take you an hour's worth of watching time and compress it down into just one continuous spoken thing, you probably maybe only got 10, 15 minutes of history. Whereas with a YouTube video, okay, people have sponsors, etc., but those segments tend to be 60 to 90 seconds. And the rest of it is usually a continuous flow of information. So if you listen to someone who does an hour-long YouTube video, you're probably going to get about 4 to 5 times as much narrative content as you would with an hour-long TV program, just from the start of it, let alone questions about accuracy and everything. So, yeah, I think overall, YouTube is theoretically is in a very good place to advance knowledge of history. But it is a little bit of a minefield because of some of those channels out there that are hideously inaccurate. The one I always like to quote is someone sent me a link to it and I shut it down within the first 30 seconds because, you had dramatic music and then it was the German battleship Admiral Hipper. And I was like, well, one, Admiral Hipper's a heavy cruiser. And two, the movie you're showing is of the Scharnhorst. So this is almost a fractally wrong video to start with, and it was titled something really clickbaity, like the German battleship that terrified the Royal Navy. And I was like, well, if you were going to have a title like that at all, maybe you could apply that to Bismarck or Tirpitz, and even then you're overselling it a bit. But to apply that to a heavy cruiser, which you then mislabel and can't even properly identify on screen visually, I'm sorry, but at this point, you might as well have just thrown spaghetti at the screen and called that a German battleship for all the level of accuracy I can expect from the rest of that content.
Yeah. Before I turn things over to Chris for a second, it is a very apposite thing to talk about at time of filming, time of recording, because it just so happens that YouTube has suddenly had, big viral video about lazy video essays and
yes.
But yes, no, back onto the technical side, though, for a bit.
Oh, yes. So, I've been a longtime fan of your channel, so I'm very grateful that I get to be on today. Get to be on today to be part of this interview. And one of the things about naval history that is so fascinating is that so much of it goes beyond almost the standard historian's craft, and it does tend to involve a lot of more what we consider kind of a lot of STEM subjects, a lot of engineering, a lot of science, technical backgrounds, and you've done a lot of videos on the metallurgy of battleship armor. And as I recall, your own personal background is as an engineer. So I want to ask, so how do you feel that your engineering background plays into your work in history? And kind of as a segue from the previous question, how you feel that YouTube is at providing a diversity of views in breaking out of the ivory tower, so to speak, and bringing in these kind of various perspectives to kind of improve our understanding of the past.
So with the latter part, I think, obviously, as I kind of said earlier, because anyone can upload, YouTube is better than most. Because again, if you're going to do a TV documentary or whatever, a lot of the time people are just like, well, does this person have a degree in X? Have they published so many books in Y? And if not, they're just like, well, okay, off. They don't even want to know. Which, again, it's a bit of a lazy process. You can understand why, perhaps under the pressures of production time, they would use that as a filter. But given some of the people you see popping up on TV history documentaries, you do wonder how they got through the rest of the filtering process, or whether that even was the only filtering process. Whereas, because people on YouTube, anyone can upload, I think the only limitation is that when you are working on YouTube, even if you don't have your face on your videos an awful lot, so obviously most of my stuff's behind pictures and archive videos, but even then you still have to be able to present, and you have to be able to articulate. You kind of have to have a voice for radio kind of thing. And if you don't, you could have as much knowledge as you could ever possibly want, but if you can't communicate that yourself, you're in trouble. You're not going to really ever succeed on YouTube. And I suppose that's the flip side of it. If someone is very articulate and can communicate, they can sell you almost anything, regardless of whether or not it's true. But with regards to engineering, I think it's helped me a lot, because, as you mentioned, there is a lot of engineering involved in warships. It's probably, of all the things, the most. I mean, there's a lot of engineering that goes into tanks and aircraft and all sorts, but ships are just so much bigger. And that's helped me partly in being able to explain the more technical side of naval history. Like you said, like, why is battleship armor plate made of a hard face and a soft face? Why is steel better than iron? Why is iron better than wood? Why is this kind of cannon really big and short and fat, and this kind of cannon is really long and thin, but somehow is more powerful than this short fat one that's got a bigger bore, and this kind of stuff. So that really helps, because it allows me to explain a side of things that perhaps other more academic historians can't. So if you've got a degree in history, you might understand why this battle happened, and you understand that, yes, according to this report, such and such a ship was hit by a torpedo at 10 o'clock, but how that torpedo resulted in the ship sinking, you may not understand, because that's an engineering problem. Whereas for me, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see exactly how this happened, and I will tell you exactly how it happened in extreme detail. So it complements the more academic side of things, I think. But it also means that I at least, I mean, obviously, I've done an engineering degree, so I don't know how other degrees are taught, because I haven't attended those degrees. But at least when I was doing my engineering degree, there was also a very strong emphasis on being absolutely ruthless and as unbiased as possible when it came to evaluating evidence and making your calculations to come to conclusions. Because in the field of engineering that I studied, if you go, oh, well, that'll be fine, or, well, I don't like that result, or I want materials from this supplier, and you fudge things one way or the other, lots of people are going to die. And it's going to cost an awful lot of money. And unless you want a massive lawsuits hanging over your head, and the guilt of potentially having accidentally killed several thousand people, you have to make sure you are as ruthless as possible when it comes to working out what the real answer is. Which is an approach I try to apply when it comes to naval history as well. And I think it applies to lots of different fields, where people say, well, if people on both sides are screaming at you that you're biased the other way, then you're probably somewhere in the middle, which is probably right. And I do see that sometimes. It's very weird. You can have people in the same video accusing me of being, because I'm half British, half Bolivian, and people seem to for some reason that means I'm completely British. People are like, it's a Brit, therefore he obviously favours the Royal Navy. But 3 comments down, there'll be someone who says, "Oh, why are you slagging off the Royal Navy again? Are you one of these like extreme left wingers who thinks the British Empire was worse than Hitler or something?" And everything in between. You do a video that's I don't know, Japan versus America, and you'll have people accuse some people will accuse you of taking either side. At which point I'm like, well, actually, if I've got the extremists on one side who really think Japan is the best thing since sliced bread, and the extremists on the other side who think America is the best thing since sliced bread, and they're both arguing that I favour the other side because I dared to say something that wasn't 100% positive about their favoured side, I'm probably striking the right balance. Yeah, I think being an engineer does help, certainly. Although I will admit at the same time, and this is part of the reason why I stick to naval history and I stick to sort of not necessarily a specific field within it, but a certain range of fields. I don't do really a lot about the social side and then the political side of things unless it intrudes on the main part of it, of what I look at, because I really don't understand that. If somebody says, there's interpersonal conflict between these two admirals, I'm like, great, why? And perhaps someone who's done a more traditional history degree or war studies degree will be able to say, well, actually that's because of this and this, and they had this personal disagreement, and maybe their fathers hated each other. I don't know any of that, and frankly I don't actually care because if two admirals are having massive arguments in the background about how a ship's going to be designed and it's all down to personal issues, I don't care what those personal issues are at all. The engineering side of me is just like, well, what was the outcome? What ship did they build, and what ship could they have built if they just acted like adults? And that's the bit I'll focus on, rather than why they got into a 6-year slanging match over which type of gun that should be equipped.
Yes, in some ways I'm almost the exact opposite. In my background, my focus is on the on Imperial Japan. So if I had my way, we would be spending this entire hour talking about the Imperial Japanese Navy and all their lovely ideas on ship design and whatnot. But so that we can try to keep this for a more general audience, a lot of your content, of course, does tend to focus on World War I, World War II, the kind of the age of steam, and of course that tends to be the area where most people are interested in. People are always going to be interested in the famous names from World War II. But you've also done a lot of videos that kind of stretch way into the past. If I remember, you did a video about Byzantine naval warfare, and you've been doing a lot of content on Age of Sail stuff. So one question I would like to ask is, how far back are you willing to look when you're doing your research process? Because of course, as you look further back in the past, the number of sources you have begins to diminish, and sometimes you are left with only a handful of sources that even mention the topic you're trying to look at. So, as you look further back into the past, how has that impacted your research messages, and about maybe how far back are you willing to look when it comes to looking at the earliest days of naval history?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about the number of sources that are available. Because personally, I'm willing to go back as far as it'll go. If someone can come up with a decent account of the first man in the first floating log to throw a javelin at the other guy he didn't like in the other floating log, I will cover that. Ancient Egypt, Phoenicia, Greece, Rome, Carthage, the Byzantines, as you mentioned, I will quite happily cover all of that. However, the main problem, as you said, is basically sourcing. Because if you go back to the age of sail, even as far back as, I wouldn't necessarily completely the Tudor period, but maybe the Elizabethan period, we have ship plans. We have, we know what the ships looked like. We know how they operated. We've got a decent number of versions of accounts of various incidents. And for things like the Armada, we've got quite a lot of period pictorial representation of how they were acting and so forth. And that carries through sort of the classic Age of Sail, Nelson, Anglo-Dutch wars, all that kind of stuff. Because a lot of it is also derivative, you're kind of working backwards from the dreadnoughts of World War I to the ironclads of the late 19th century, the steam-powered wooden ships of the early 19th century, to the sail-powered only ships, and then back and back and back. And I think that sort of falls back on me being an engineer. I can kind of see the evolution in reverse happening, so I can understand to a certain degree what's going on. Once you get further back, as you say, kind of the sources start to peter out. We don't necessarily know exactly what ships looked like. A lot of stuff falls into the area of experimental archaeology, which is still going on. And I mean, that's good, because you think about, even maybe when I was a kid, you could read about Viking longships, but they were a lot of the time, outside of some very niche academic circles, they were treated as kind of a thing. Whereas nowadays, you look through the literature and it's, there's about half a dozen main different types of quote unquote long ship, with different roles of different sizes, different capabilities. People have built replicas and sailed them to understand how their performance works, etc. So that's an ongoing field. But I think when it comes to the much, much older stuff, so when you're talking about early medieval and before Roman, etc., whilst I like to read about it, and I could do a relatively decent job of sort of narrating some of the better covered events, like major battles, for a lot of that kind of period, I try, if possible, to fall back on interviews with people who have studied those areas in extreme detail, because something like, I mean, not necessarily Trafalgar, because Trafalgar isn't a line of battle, but say the Anglo-Dutch Wars, Age of Sail, but they're mostly fighting in a line of battle that gradually degrades into a general fight. And to be honest, World War I and World War II engagements, there's a lot of a line of battles that degenerate into a general fight. So there's certain commonality there. Whereas if you go back to, say, the Punic Wars, and everybody's charging around trying to ram each other, there's, at least even as far back as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, everyone pretty much agrees they were trying to shoot at each other with cannon and then eventually get in for boarding. Whereas in the Punic Wars, there's arguments of, were people trying to ram each other to sink themselves, to sink each other? Were they trying to ram each other to cut the oars off the other guy's ship and then board? When they boarded, were the Romans using a corvus? How long did they use a corvus for? Is the corvus even a thing, or is it a post-fact propaganda invention? And there's so much uncertainty surrounding a lot of that as I say, I prefer to just find someone and go, okay, well, these are the questions I think would be interesting to know about. In your months, years, etc. of research, what have you found? And let them answer, and then I provide the platform to distribute that information to a wider audience, because otherwise I'm going to end up guessing in some areas. And as I said, I don't want to, if someone challenges me and they say, oh, well, why did you say that? And I go, well, I guessed. That's not a proper response from a historian, really. I did one video on the Battle of Actium, for example, and that whole video is littered with, well, this source says this, and this source says this, and this source says, we have three sources, they all completely disagree. So I'm going to, and then I'm like, well, I've inferred that it's probably this, but it's very heavy on the this is an inference kind of thing. Whereas once you get into the classic Age of Sail and World War I, World War II, things are a lot more documented. I mean, people will still argue forever and a day about details, but the general theme of what happened is much more settled, with a few notable exceptions. At some point, I will need to do a video about the Battle of the Yalu River between the Japanese and the Chinese in the late 19th century, because no two sources agree on what happened there. It's that whole video, I think, is just going to be a bit of a comedy sketch of, well, the battle started, or did it? Maybe it started an hour later, and when it started, these were the two fleets. Or were they? Because three different sources give three different fleets, and they were in three different formations, and it's a mess.
Yeah, I remember trying to look into that once and just trying to work out what actually happened to Admiral Dingru Chang. Did he blow himself up? Was there something wrong with the guns? Did he simply get shot by the Japanese? But segueing, I suppose, back into broader questions, aside from talking a bit more about Age of Sail recently, I remember a couple of months ago you ended up talking about tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was curious about is, if you're allowed to talk about it, how did that come about? Because at least from what I can recall, I don't recall you having too much engagement directly with a lot of other history YouTubers. Maybe I'm wrong. But, I mean, how much engagement would you say that you have? Do you think you would like to have more engagement with other parts of History YouTube, or considering some of the issues we've discussed, do you think you've already had a bit too much exposure?
So I have collaborated with a number of historical YouTubers, mostly obviously on the naval side, shockingly enough. But it depends on the YouTuber in question, because you have some where it's just like, I acknowledge you're a good naval history channel. Let's do a collaboration, and it's fun to do. But I think to a certain degree, it's also as much a kind of a mutual acknowledgement to both of our audiences that, hey, this other guy exists, and by working with them, you are basically giving them your stamp of approval and saying, look, this guy is also doing good work. Which I think speaks to your point about you do have to be a bit careful sometimes. But I think it depend. The flip side of that is that sometimes you can meet other people who work in the YouTube history sphere, and you get on really well, and you actually look forward to meeting each other again. But there's not a huge amount of overlap between what you do. So, for example, I get along really well with Bernard, who does military history visualized, Chris, who does military aviation history. And we all get along really well. But of course, Bernard is mostly focused on the land-based side of things. And Chris, shockingly enough, does aircraft. And there's, outside of the occasional shore bombardment and whatever, there's not a huge amount of overlap between what me and Bernard do. But we have done a few crossovers occasionally where it does overlap. There's a little bit more interaction between aircraft and ships, so I've worked a bit more with Chris on that. But then there's other channels like the Operations Room. I get on really well with him, and we've done a bunch of crossovers, mostly centered around the Guadalcanal campaign, where it's kind of I provide my research and script writing, and then he provides the visuals, and then we both win because I'm frankly not very good at animated 3D graphics, and because I'd already done pretty much all of those battles already, it meant I could just go, here, have some scripts, which saves him a bunch of time in having to look it all up. So yeah, I've worked with a reasonable number of YouTubers, and I think it does fairly well. But at the same time, there is a limit to how many crossovers and so forth you can do, because even if people watch multiple channels covering roughly the same subject, a lot of the time they are there to watch that person's content in that person's style. So the occasional crossover is great, but you don't want to make it too often, otherwise people get a bit confused and start turning off. And I mean, there's other things that I like doing in like my personal life, because like you mentioned with the tank museum. So, I like tanks, I like military aircraft, I know a reasonable amount about them, but I don't know anywhere near as much about them as I do ships. So I stick to ships unless it involves one of those elements. So at some point I've got to pop back to the tank museum because I want to do a long video on an even longer video on the development of the tank, because it's incredibly heavily tied into the Royal Navy, believe it or not. So that's something I'm going to work with the tank museum on. And I have other personal hobbies, mostly history related. I've worked, I've done a few videos with Matt Easton, who runs the Scholar Gladiatoria channel, because I do medieval reenactment and historical European martial arts. So we're good friends, and he is the expert in that field. But that has naval connotations with naval specialist weapons and boarding actions and stuff. So there's an amount of crossover there. And, even getting into the slightly more esoteric, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm half English, half Bolivian. I like the Bolivian side of my heritage quite a bit. So I do a lot of my own personal research into Inca history. Inca history has virtually nothing to do with naval history, apart from one expedition by Tupa Inca, which basically consists of, and he sent a bunch of ships off into the Pacific, and no one knows what happened to them at the end, which is one of those great mysteries of like, where did they all go and what happened? But there's no real place for Inca history as a result on my channel. But at some point, once I've once I've done even more research, I'm hoping at some point to maybe do an appearance on Scholarly Editorial where I can talk about Inca weapons, which nothing to do, it's history, but it's nothing to do with naval history, and probably something that a lot of people who are interested in HEMA and reenactment probably never heard of, despite the fact it's actually technically smack bang in that sort of medieval Renaissance period that it's happening.
With that in mind, and with the idea of audiences, I mean, that carries over into a question of, how much do you feel like you write for an audience versus writing for yourself, basically? I mean, obviously, Dry Dock is the major exception because you are explicitly answering questions that have been asked.
Yes.
But, I mean, do you find that audience interest influences, for instance, the 5-minute videos in terms of what ships you think, this might be a good one to talk about?
So this is one of actually the really weird things when it comes to YouTube, in that there are a few broad topics that will always attract interest. But equally, a lot of the time, I genuinely have no idea what the general YouTube audience is going to find interesting. So when it comes to the Wednesday videos, 2 videos per month are voted on by my patrons on Patreon. So everyone puts suggestions into a ring. I say, okay, here's all the suggestions people came up with last month. People vote on it, and unless it's hilariously inappropriate, the winning vote gets a video made on it. But the majority of the Wednesday videos are just things that I've decided I'm going to talk about that month. And sometimes those scripts will take me a week to do. Sometimes there'll be something I've worked on for years. I mean, I did my Nelson series, and then there was like a 2-3 year hiatus between the last Nelson and Battle of Trafalgar, which was kind of going to be the last one, because I basically was just researching the Battle of Trafalgar on and off for that intervening period, trying to nail down every inconsistency and detail. So when it comes to the videos that I write that I personally choose for the Wednesday stuff, it's just like, I think this will be an interesting bit of naval history for people to hear about. And if they're interested in it, then great. And if they're not, then oh well, next week's another week. But as I say, a lot of the time I have no idea what people are going to really... There's some stuff where I've spent a lot of time and money creating the video thinking this is really good. No one's really watched it. And other times a video where I've just gone, yeah, well, I suppose I read an article or read a book recently. Let's do a bit more about that. And it's just taken off. I mean, to be honest, the only things really that you can almost guarantee everyone will watch and argue about is something about Bismarck, because everyone loves arguing about Bismarck. And weirdly enough, the Japanese Navy. Everyone loves the Japanese Navy for some reason. But yeah, outside of that, I think the only other stuff would be various little mini series, because sometimes I'll do a video and I'll think initially I want to do this subject, which is kind of like how, say, for example, my US Pacific Fleet Submarine Campaign video series came about. I thought, I'll cover the submarine campaign. And I very quickly realized there's no way you can encapsulate the entire campaign in an hour and do it any justice. So I thought, well, you know what, I'll do the first year. And if it generates interest, then I'll continue with all the other material I found. And if it doesn't, well, then I haven't written 200 pages of script on something that no one was interested in. And it turns out apparently everybody loves that. So now I'm continuing that as and when I get the material available to me.
I think this is the part where I ask a few slightly lazy questions that are formulated in a very similar way, but which follow on quite closely. Because the first would be, like, which ship or class of ship or campaign even did you find the most interesting to research, would you say?
Oh, that's a good one. I would say probably the one I found most interesting to research so far, I think it would actually be there would be a kind of a joint winner, and it would be Admirals. And in both cases, it would be because I knew the Admirals by reputation, and I knew them by their key highlights of their career, but then getting into the details of their lives and finding out that actually, it wasn't regular, flash in the pan, regular. These guys were actually brilliant, as in really smart, intelligent people. Brilliant people who continuously showed those qualities, and perhaps we only remember them for a handful of engagements because they're big and flashy, but then people miss the fact that they're actually having even more effect on their services and the campaigns they fought outside of those engagements, but people have never heard about that. And I think those two would be Admiral Willis Lee, from the US Navy in World War II, and which I've done a video on, and another admiral which I haven't done a video on. It's probably going to be multiple videos, which is Admiral Hawke of the Royal Navy in the Age of Sail, because Hawke's one of those ones who's not quite as well known as people like Nelson or Cochrane. And if he's known by most people for anything, it's probably the Battle of Quiberon Bay, which I've often, to be honest, with the Battle of Quiberon Bay, I've often said is essentially the Pirates of the Caribbean 3 finale fight on steroids with several dozen ships. And possibly when you read it, it sounds slightly less plausible as well. But he still pulled it off. But then when you look into his whole career, it's like suddenly the idea of somebody leading a fleet of ships of the line into a bunch of shoals for which he has no charts in the middle of a driving storm doesn't actually sound so ridiculous anymore. It sounds very much like business as usual for Admiral Hawke. And it's the same thing, again with Admiral Lee, with Washington versus Kirishima. Everyone goes, perfect ambush, perfect accuracy. Wasn't this amazing? And then you look back and realize, actually, to be honest, Admiral Lee probably wouldn't have settled for anything less, considering the guy had the classic Coke bottle thick glasses and yet sat in the middle of a street during one of the Mexican-American conflicts with a rifle, counter-sniping multiple people. It's like, how many times do you have an Olympic-level sniper who has, glasses thick enough to focus the power of the sun? But he manages it. And it's those kind of, I think it's those kind of people where there's this weird juxtaposition of people doing amazing things, but they have other issues that mean you would not expect them to do that in any way, shape, or form. Those are the things I really like the most.
This is a similar question to which I'm going to insist on a slightly different answer.
Okay.
Ships, admirals, campaigns, whatever, that you would consider more people should know about?
Mm-hmm. Right. Now that I can definitely give a couple of different answers to. So ships that people should know more about, I think there's a whole range of ironclads in the late 19th century, because people tend to kind of go ship of the line, ironclad, which vaguely means something depending on if you're American, ironclad immediately calls to mind USS Monitor. If you're British, it's HMS Warrior, etc. And then people are like ironclads, something, pre-dreadnought, maybe something, World War One. And they don't, the amount of technological advancement and research, and in some cases crazy experimentation that was going on in the late 19th century, that really needs to be known more, because, for all the fact that obviously, war leads to massive amounts of death and destruction, I still kind of wish there had been a massive knockdown, drag-out naval action between Britain and France, or one of the other major naval powers, in the late 1870s and early 1880s, purely to see what this madcap fleet of experiments would have actually done. Because before and after that period, ships are mostly homogeneous. They're not obviously identical, but they're roughly similar in capabilities. But in that time period, you look at a much smaller scale and like the Battle of Lissa between Austria-Hungary and Italy. Almost every ship is completely different in its capabilities, and you can't predict what on earth is going to happen. If you look at Lissa on paper, you go, well, this ship is clearly going to do better than everyone else, and this ship is going to be terrible. And it turns out it's actually the completely other way around. But in terms of campaigns, I think of all the campaigns I probably will really, really enjoy putting on the screen in the next couple of years, I think probably the Anglo-Dutch Wars, because there's a huge number of them to start with, and outside of maybe the raid on the Medway, most people haven't heard of them, but they're hugely foundational, not just to the histories of the Netherlands and Britain, but they're hugely foundational to the world as we understand it. because you're coming out of the era of the Spanish Armada and, in the English case, the English Civil War. And there's not necessarily a power vacuum, but you've got multiple competing great powers at sea: Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, etc. And to get from there to sort of the semi-eternal war that we have with France for the latter part of the 18th century, in between, there's this massive knockdown, drag-out fight with the Dutch, who for a while look like they're actually going to be the major seaborne imperial power. And not only does that set the foundation for everything that's to come in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, but also it's one of the major conflicts where the Royal Navy is actually going back and forth between winning and losing. It's not like the Napoleonic Wars where usually Britain will come out on top, or even the War of 1812 where we have a few embarrassing setbacks but eventually lock everything down, or World War I where the Germans mostly, not entirely, but for the most part, stay in port. There's kind of this narrative around a lot of those conflicts of, either Britain will win or eventually Britain will win. But in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, we lose a couple of them straight up, and the rest are very, very hard fought. And at the time, these were cataclysmic level conflicts for Northern Europe. But I definitely think that needs to be, more people need to know about them.
I think to round us off and stay on the sort of subjects of interest area, what do you think is the most interesting path not taken in ship design, and why is it the Novgorod?
Yeah, Novgorod. I must remember when I started researching that, I was very surprised by actually how capable the thing was. There's a huge number of flaws to that poor old thing, but it's a lot more capable than the memes would sometimes have you believe. But in terms of the path not taken, that's actually a really good one. There's really obvious, but they're all history ones, like what if the aircraft carrier was never invented? But that's that's departing from the realms of physics. In terms of, I think in terms of something that stays within the technological developments of what we have now, sort of the historical timeline, possibly alternate ways of developing history there. I think probably, and I know this might cause some controversy with some people, but maybe I think the torpedo ram, actually. The torpedo ram will be my closest thing. And I mean, you can see why it died out, because the advent of quick-firing guns, the relative lack of capability of torpedoes in the late 19th century, it meant that by the end of the 19th century, the torpedo ram was basically dead in the water as a concept. But at the same time, when you wind the clock forward 10, 15 years, and suddenly you can make small ships hit 35, 40 plus knots, and especially once you get into the latter stages of the interwar period, where now you've got like the Japanese developing the long lance and torpedoes actually getting quite a significant range, the idea of a small, high-speed, heavily protected ship that just throws torpedoes out left, right, and center, and maybe will also try and poke a hole in you itself, it might have a lot more currency than you suspect. That would be my main candidate. A secondary candidate would be potentially just delaying World War II by a couple of years, because it's actually quite interesting when you look at what everybody was building and anticipating to build in the last stages of the 1930s, and how much of they got either massively delayed or flat out cancelled by the outbreak of war, when almost everyone was expecting a global war, but they're expecting it in 42, 43. That will probably be a sort of an alternate history path not taken, in that a World War II that breaks out 2-3 years after the historical one is going to look completely different to the one we expect because of the way history went.
With regards to torpedo rams, presumably that's not just because you have this hypothetical coat of arms for HMS Thunderchild.
No. I mean, I love HMS Thunderchild because it's War of the Worlds. It's a really good bit of fiction. But no, I genuinely think it could it could have worked. And I mean, to be honest, it's surprising just how much a heavily armored torpedo-equipped warship keeps popping up after the torpedo ram goes away. It just never quite gains traction because it keeps popping up in that sort of 10, 15-year period where it's not quite going to work. In fact, I was actually finishing a 5-minute guide script for early next year on the torpedo battleship, which was the proposal of the 1910s in the US Navy. But as I say, that's kind of, it's in that 10, 15-year period where it's still not quite a practical concept, but it's kind of the last gasp in the US Navy for that idea.
I, for one, would very much like to see what the Imperial Japanese Navy would have done with the idea of a torpedo ram or torpedo battleship. That would have been that would have been fascinating to see what they would have come up with.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those great unanswered questions, obviously, because they kind of do it with Kitakami and Oi, although they're not quite the same concept, but they never quite see action. It's one of those things like, of all the Japanese ships that they didn't throw randomly at the Americans, the one with the more torpedoes that as minor deity is they just kept behind.
So I did. You kind of already came on to this question, but I was curious since you did bring up earlier the idea of this hypothetical war in the late 19th century to see what would have happened with all these strange designs. And I was going to kind of expand on this, and like you kind of did with this delayed World War II, is beyond those two, like, is there any other kind of hypothetical naval conflict that you would have, that purely from an academic standpoint, kind of seeing what would have happened, is there any kind of hypothetical naval conflict you would have had liked to have seen play out that we wish we could have studied, ignoring all the terrible human costs of war and all that comes with it?
Yeah, I think probably if I had to pick one, I would think there'd probably be the early 1850s, early to mid 1850s, purely because you've got steam power. You've got shell-firing guns. You've got almost everything apart from the iron armor that will become the ironclad era, but you've still got something that will be recognizable at the Battle of Trafalgar with 2- and 3-deck ships of the line. So you have this theoretically very vulnerable force because of all the shell guns and the wooden hulls, and a big conflict breaking out then that actually results in some major naval actions will be quite interesting, because of course we do have a very major conflict breaking out there with the Crimean War, but annoyingly for those of us who wanted to see how that would play out on a naval stage, the Russian fleet goes and hides in ports and then sinks it itself. So the only real indication we have of that kind of last stage of the wooden warship in terms of its combat performance is the Battle of Sinop, which is at the very beginning of the Crimean War. But unfortunately, when it comes to the Battle of Sinop, people look at it and go, "Oh yes, shell guns. They have clearly destroyed the Ottoman fleet. Therefore, they must be superior." But when you actually look at the balance of power, it's actually the Russians showed up with multiple 100+ gun first-rate ships of the line. That was going to be a one-sided slaughter, no matter what ammunition you stuck in the guns.
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, the last hour has absolutely flown past, clearly. And one of us is starting to run out of time. So I'd like to thank you again for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. And if you want me back at any point, just drop me an email. I'm quite happy to come back and have a chat.
Absolutely. We do have your details now. You cannot get away from us.
Yes. Thank you very much for coming on to join the podcast today. It has been very enlightening.
No worries. Thanks very much, guys.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.